Principle 1. Proximity without connection. It was the first rule, the foundation upon which my entire professional existence was built. To be a shadow, a presence felt but not known. To be the armor for another man's body, you had to be certain your own was impenetrable. For years this code had been my sanctuary, a fortress of rigid protocols that kept the chaos of the world and the chaos within myself at a manageable, sterile distance. I existed in the space beside, behind, always adjacent to life, but never truly in it. My job was to observe, to anticipate, to neutralize threats. It was a life of calculated distances and silent assessments, and I had become a master of it. My heart beat at a steady, regulated 60 beats per minute. My breathing was a controlled and silent engine, and my thoughts were a catalog of angles, exits, and potential dangers. I was a machine of quiet vigilance. The assignment was, on paper, no different from the dozen that had preceded it. The client, a titan of industry with a net worth that defied comprehension. The principal, his son and heir, Theodore. The location, a remote, high-security estate nestled in the jagged teeth of a mountain range. A place so isolated it felt like the world had forgotten it existed. The duration, 72 hours, during which a delicate corporate merger would be finalized via encrypted channels. My purpose? To ensure the principal remained secure, a living asset protected from any conceivable threat, external or otherwise. It was simple. It was clean. It was the lie I told myself as the helicopter blades beat a frantic rhythm against the thin, cold air. I had seen Theodore's file, of course. A collection of sterile facts and grainy paparazzi photos that painted a portrait of bored, untouchable privilege. He was educated at the best schools, dressed in the finest clothes, and wore an expression of perpetual, languid disdain. He was the kind of man whose life was a foregone conclusion, a golden path laid out before him at birth. He was everything I was not. He was the reason the fortress existed, the embodiment of a world I was paid to guard but never enter. He was just a principal, a package to be delivered safely to the other side of the weekend. He was waiting on the helipad when we landed, a tall, lean silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a dark cashmere sweater that seemed to drink the fading light. The wind whipped his dark hair across his brow, but he didn't seem to notice the cold. He just stood there, hands shoved into the pockets of his trousers, watching our descent with an unnerving stillness. My first assessment was clinical. Posture, relaxed, almost insolent. Demeanor, indifferent. Threat level, negligible. He was a boy playing at being a man, insulated from the world by a fortune so vast it constituted its own form of gravity. I stepped out of the helicopter first, my feet hitting the concrete with a solid, grounding thud. I scanned the perimeter, a habit so ingrained it was like breathing. Pine trees, jagged rock faces, a single steel and glass structure that was the estate. Nothing. The only thing moving was the wind, a lonely, keening sound that slipped through the trees. "You must be Liam," Theodore said. His voice was lower than I expected, a smooth baritone with a slightly rough edge, like expensive whiskey. It cut through the whine of the slowing helicopter blades. I didn't offer a hand. Protocol. "Sir." The word was a shield, a wall erected in a single syllable. He gave a slight humorless smile, his eyes, a startlingly pale gray, flicking over me. It wasn't a cursory glance. It was an appraisal. I felt it slide over my uniform, my posture, my very stillness. It felt like being weighed and measured. For a brief, unsettling moment, I felt like the one being assessed. He saw the fortress. I wondered if he could see the prisoner inside. The lockdown began 6 hours later. A disembodied voice from a hidden speaker system announced a Level 4 security alert. A breach in the outer perimeter's electronic surveillance. The estate, a marvel of paranoid architecture, went into its pre-programmed defense mode. Steel shutters slid down over the panoramic windows, encasing us in a tomb of glass and brushed metal. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and pressurized. We were cut off, contained. The world outside ceased to exist. The estate security chief, a disembodied voice over the comms, was calm, professional. For the principal's absolute security, you will both be confined to the primary suite until the threat is neutralized. The suite is a self-contained panic room. No one gets in or out. Understood? Understood, I replied, my own voice a flat echo in the sterile quiet. The primary suite was a cavern of minimalist luxury. A vast living area, a cavernous bathroom, and a single sleeping area dominated by a bed large enough for 4. One bed. The air, recycled and temperature-controlled, suddenly felt thin, insufficient. My lungs struggled to draw a full breath. This is the job. The thought was a mantra, a desperate prayer. Maintain proximity. Neutralize threat. The threat, I was beginning to realize, wasn't outside the steel shutters. It was inside. It was the vast, silent space between me and the other man in the room. It was the fact that for the first time in my career, the professional line I had drawn in the sand had been washed away by a tide I hadn't seen coming. Proximity without connection. The rule was already breaking. Theodore showed no outward sign of alarm. He simply walked to the bar, poured himself a drink, and surveyed his gilded cage with that same infuriatingly calm expression. He was a creature of controlled environments. This was just a smaller, more secure version of the one he already inhabited. He turned, leaning back against the cool marble of the bar, the crystal glass held loosely in his long fingers. "Well," he said, his voice laced with a dry irony that scraped against my nerves. "This is cozy." I didn't respond. I took up my position by the door, the designated point of entry and exit, even though it was sealed. My body fell into its familiar state of readiness, feet shoulder-width apart, hands clasped loosely behind my back, eyes scanning the room in a repetitive, meaningless pattern. I was a statue, a piece of security hardware. That's what he had to see me as. It's what I had to be. But the silence. It was a physical entity. It pressed in, magnifying every tiny sound. The soft clink of ice against his glass. The whisper of expensive wool as he shifted his weight. The impossibly loud, rhythmic sound of his breathing. I found myself tracking it, my own breath unconsciously trying to sync with his. I caught myself, forced my lungs back into their own steady, solitary rhythm. Control. It was all about control. He moved from the bar to one of the low leather sofas, sinking into it with a sigh. He didn't look at me, but I felt his awareness of me. It was a tangible pressure against my skin. I was a fixed point in his periphery, a constant, silent observer. This was the dynamic I was used to, the one I cultivated. I was furniture, necessary, but unnoticed. But he wasn't following the script. "Do you ever get tired of it?" he asked, his voice quiet, conversational. It was a violation, a direct, personal inquiry. My training supplied the answer before I could think. "My only concern is your safety, sir." The words were automatic, devoid of inflection. He took a slow sip of his drink, his gray eyes fixed on me over the rim of the glass. That wasn't my question. The first crack in the armor. A hairline fracture, but I felt it. A flicker of something hot and unfamiliar. Annoyance? Panic? I doubled down on my training. Silence was a tool, a deflection. I remained still, my gaze fixed on a point on the far wall, just over his left shoulder. He sighed again, a soft exhalation of what sounded like resignation, and finally looked away, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. The moment passed. The boundary was tested, and it held. But the air was different now. The professional distance I so carefully maintained had been measured and found wanting. He had reached across it, and even though I hadn't taken his hand, the space between us felt charged, alive with a static I couldn't name. The fortress was still standing, but the ground beneath it had begun to shift. The 72 hours stretched before me like a desolate, uncharted territory, and for the first time in a very long time, I was afraid of getting lost. Hours bled into one another. The recycled air grew stale, thick with the scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something else, something sharp and clean like juniper, and the faint metallic tang of our shared confinement. My world shrank to the dimensions of this suite, my senses amplifying until every detail of his presence became an overwhelming symphony of sensory data. I was an analyst, drowning in information. The sound of his breathing. It was the room's metronome. In the oppressive silence, I could hear the subtle shift in its rhythm when he was reading, a slow, even cadence. I heard the slight catch when he turned a page, the deeper draw of air when he stood up. At some point, he fell asleep on the sofa, his head lolling to one side, and the sound softened, became more vulnerable. My own breathing felt ragged and loud in comparison, a clumsy, discordant intrusion. I had to consciously regulate it, forcing air in and out in measured, silent puffs, as if I could somehow erase my own presence from the soundscape of the room. I was failing. The heat. He was a furnace. When he moved, he left a trail of warmth in the air that my skin registered long after he'd passed. He paced for a while, a restless energy coiling in him, and his path carved a current of heat through the chilled, sterile environment. He stopped near my post by the door once, turning to look at the blank steel as if he could see through it. He stood less than 2 feet away. The heat rolling off his body was a physical force, a pressure wave that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. I smelled the wool of his sweater, the warmth of his skin beneath it. It was intimate. It was agonizing. I held my breath, a statue carved from ice, praying he would move before I melted completely. This is a tactical assessment, I told myself. Proximity to the principal is a variable. Body temperature is a data point. It was a pathetic lie, a desperate attempt to reframe the overwhelming physical reality of him into something my training could process. The fortress was crumbling, and I was frantically trying to patch the walls with flimsy protocol. The first accidental touch happened near the bar. He had gone to refill his glass, and I, on a slow, pointless security sweep of the room, passed behind him. The space was wide, more than enough for 2 people. But he chose that exact moment to turn, his body moving with an unthinking, fluid grace. His hand, the one not holding the glass, brushed against the back of mine. It was nothing. A flicker of contact. Skin on skin. A jolt of pure electricity shot up my arm, short-circuiting every synapse in my brain. My hand recoiled as if burned. The air crackled. For a split second, the world narrowed to that single point of contact. The warmth of his skin, the surprising roughness of a callus on his palm. He froze. His head turned, and his gray eyes locked onto mine. The surprise in them was genuine, quickly followed by something else. Something questioning. He didn't apologize. I didn't acknowledge it. We just stood there, caught in a sudden, breathless tableau, the air thick with the unspoken. He felt it too. The thought was a betrayal, a dangerous, seductive whisper in the ruins of my self-control. I broke the contact first, my training kicking in like an autoimmune response. I completed my turn, my movements stiff, robotic, and continued my sweep of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I did not look back, but I felt his gaze on me, a physical weight against my shoulders, all the way across the room. The analysis began instantly, a frantic, spiraling monologue in my head. It was an accident. The space was misjudged. The contact was incidental. It meant nothing. I repeated the words over and over, but they were hollow, meaningless. The phantom sensation of his skin against mine lingered, a brand I couldn't erase. Later, in what passed for night in our windowless prison, the lights dimmed on an automatic cycle. He had retreated to the enormous bed, lying on his side, facing away from the room. I remained at my post, a sentinel in the manufactured twilight. I assumed he was asleep. I allowed a fraction of my rigid posture to soften. "I know you're watching me." His voice, low and slightly rough with sleep, sliced through the quiet. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. My muscles went rigid again. "I'm ensuring your safety, sir." He was silent for a long moment. I could hear the rustle of the sheets as he shifted. "Is that what you call it?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. It didn't need a response. We both knew he wasn't talking about a physical threat. The danger in this room was formless, silent, and it was growing with every shared breath. The moment came hours later, or perhaps minutes. Time had become a thick, viscous fluid. He was standing by the sealed windows, his forehead pressed against the cool steel as if trying to absorb some sense of the outside world. I was on the opposite side of the room, a study in forced stillness. My eyes were doing their programmed sweep, but my focus, my entire being, was a laser pointed at the back of his head. I was cataloging the way the dim light caught the edges of his dark hair, the tense line of his shoulders under the soft cashmere, the subtle vulnerability in his posture. He looked trapped. He looked like the prisoner I felt myself to be. He must have felt the intensity of my focus. It must have been a palpable force across the room. He turned, not quickly, but with a slow, deliberate motion. His eyes found mine instantly, as if he knew exactly where to look. And he held my gaze. It wasn't like before. This was different. There was no surprise, no challenge. His expression was stripped bare of its usual ironic detachment. The boredom, the privilege, the arrogance, it was all gone. In its place was something raw, something unguarded. It was a look of profound, aching loneliness. And in that loneliness, I saw a terrifying reflection of my own. My training screamed at me to look away, break eye contact, reassert dominance. You are the guard. He is the principal. Do not engage. It was the cardinal rule of interrogation, of control. But I couldn't. I was pinned by that gaze, transfixed. It felt as if he were looking past my uniform, past my training, past the years of carefully constructed walls, and seeing the man inside. The man I kept locked away. He saw me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. All this time, I had been the observer, the one who watched from the shadows, unseen. It was the source of my power, my safety. But in that single, sustained moment of shared eye contact, the roles were reversed. He was seeing me, truly seeing me, and I was completely, terrifyingly exposed. The armor I had worn for years felt like it was dissolving, turning to smoke and ash. My heart rate, usually a placid 60 beats per minute, spiked. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears, a frantic drumbeat against the pressurized silence. My breath hitched. We stood there, 20 feet of empty space between us, connected by an invisible, high-tension wire. The air vibrated with it. You feel this too, don't you? The question was a silent scream in my mind. This gravity, this pull. I'm not imagining it. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if answering the question I hadn't dared to ask. And in that tiny movement, a universe of understanding passed between us. The lie of our roles, guard and guarded, professional and principal, was incinerated in the heat of that look. We were just two men, trapped in a box, suffocating from the same unspoken thing. He broke the gaze first, his eyes dropping to the floor. The wire between us went slack, and I could breathe again. A ragged, desperate gasp. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that for the first time looked not like a casual affectation, but a sign of deep, unsettling agitation. He had seen me. And he hadn't looked away in disgust or dismissal. He had looked at me with a recognition that shook the very foundations of my fortress. The crack wasn't a hairline fracture anymore. A whole section of the wall had just come crashing down, and I had no idea how to rebuild it. I wasn't even sure I wanted to. The shift was subtle at first, a change in the room's atmospheric pressure. The long silences that followed were no longer fraught with the tension of strangers, but with the heavy, shared weight of a secret. We had crossed a line, acknowledged something without a single word, and now we existed in the strange, uncharted territory on the other side. Theodore no longer tried to breach my professional facade with questions. He didn't have to. He had already seen what was behind it. Instead, he seemed to retreat into himself. The languid confidence that had been his armor was gone, replaced by a quiet, restless energy. He stopped pacing. He stopped drinking. He just sat, sometimes on the sofa, sometimes on the floor with his back against the bed, and stared at nothing. The mask of the untouchable billionaire's son had fallen away, and the man underneath was frayed at the edges. The break happened on the second night. The lights had dimmed again, casting the room in long, deep shadows. I was at my post, my body rigid with a new kind of vigilance. It was no longer about external threats. It was about containing the storm that was brewing inside this suite, inside of me. I heard a sound from the bed, a sharp, choked gasp. I turned. Theodore was sitting bolt upright, his back ramrod straight. In the dim light, I could see the sheen of sweat on his forehead. His hands were clenched into fists in the expensive sheets, the knuckles white. He was breathing in short, shallow pants, his chest rising and falling too quickly. My training took over. A cold, clinical voice cutting through the panic that was rising in my own chest. Assess the situation. Principal is in distress. Possible panic attack. Heart condition? No, his file is clean. This is psychological. Sir? My voice was quiet, carefully neutral. He didn't respond. His eyes were wide, unfocused, staring at the steel wall opposite the bed. He was seeing something I couldn't. He gasped again, a ragged, desperate sound, as if he were trying to draw air through water. I crossed the room in 3 silent strides. Protocol dictated I maintain distance, call for medical assistance over the comms. But the comms were silent, part of the lockdown. And the man gasping for air on the bed was not just a principal anymore. He was Theodore. And he was breaking apart in front of me. Theodore. I used his name. It felt like a monumental transgression, a shattering of the final rule. But Sir felt absurd, a lie that no longer fit the reality of this room. He flinched, his eyes snapping to me. There was pure animal terror in them. "I can't breathe," he choked out, the words fragmented. "The walls, there." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The gilded cage had become a compression chamber, the luxury a mockery. We were buried alive, and he was suffocating. My instincts, the ones that lay deeper than any training manual, took over. My duty had always been to protect his body, to be a shield between him and a bullet. But this was different. The threat was inside him. To protect him, I had to do more than stand guard. I had to be an anchor. I sat on the edge of the bed. Another violation. The proximity was dizzying. I could feel the frantic heat coming off him, smell the salt of his sweat. I kept my movements slow, deliberate. "Focus on me," I said, my voice low and steady. I pitched it to a register I knew was calming. "Look at me." His terrified gaze locked with mine. His pupils were blown wide. "Breathe with me," I commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order from a man whose entire life was about control. In. I took a slow, deep breath, exaggerating the movement of my chest. Out. I released it just as slowly. He tried to follow, but his breath just hitched in his throat, a painful, scraping sound. Tears welled in his eyes, a mixture of fear and frustration. "I can't." Without thinking, without allowing the fortress a chance to object, I reached out and placed my hand firmly on his chest, right over his heart. My palm was flat against the thin fabric of his shirt. The touch was electric, a shock wave that seemed to travel through both of us. Beneath my hand, I could feel the frantic, rabbit-fast pounding of his heart. I could feel the heat of his skin, the fine tremor that ran through his entire body. It was the most profound, terrifyingly intimate contact of my life. "Feel that?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "That's my hand. It's real. You're right here. You're safe." I applied a gentle, steady pressure, a grounding force against the chaos erupting inside him. "Now breathe. Match me. Feel my hand rise when you breathe in." I took another slow breath. This time, I felt the slight expansion of his chest against my palm as he tried to copy me. It was shallow, ragged, but it was there. "Good. Again. Out." We continued like that for minutes that felt like hours. In. Out. My voice was a low murmur, my hand a constant grounding weight on his chest. Slowly, painstakingly, the frantic rhythm of his heart began to slow. The panicked gasps softened into shuddering breaths. The terror in his eyes receded, replaced by a raw, shimmering exhaustion. He was still trembling, but he was breathing. He was with me. My role had fundamentally, irrevocably shifted. I was no longer the passive observer, the shadow at the edge of his life. In that moment, I had become his protector, in a way that had nothing to do with weapons or tactical positions. I was shielding him not from an external threat, but from himself. My hand on his chest was not a breach of protocol. It was the only tool I had that mattered. He finally slumped forward, his energy completely spent. His forehead came to rest against my shoulder. The contact was shocking in its simplicity, in its devastating surrender. His body was heavy against mine, all the tension gone out of him. I could feel his damp hair against the side of my neck, His breathing, now slow and even, puffed against my skin. I did not move. I couldn't. I held him, my hand still pressed to his chest, my other arm frozen at my side. I was his anchor. I was his shield. And in the silent, profound intimacy of that embrace, I felt the last of my own walls turn to dust. The fortress was gone. I was standing in the ruins, exposed and vulnerable, and all I could think was, stay. Just let me stay right here. The aftermath of his panic was a new kind of silence. It wasn't pressurized or heavy with unspoken things. It was a fragile, exhausted quiet, filled with the soft sounds of our breathing, which had finally, irrevocably, synced. He didn't pull away. He remained slumped against me, a dead weight of trust I was terrified I would break. I held my position, my muscles screaming from the rigid posture, but I wouldn't have moved for anything. To move felt like it would shatter the delicate peace we had found. After a long time, he stirred, lifting his head from my shoulder. He didn't move far, just enough to look at me. His eyes, in the dim light, were dark pools of exhaustion and something else I couldn't name. Gratitude? Confusion? His face was pale, his hair stuck to his damp forehead. The mask was not just cracked, it was gone. I was looking at the real Theodore for the first time, stripped of all artifice. He looked impossibly young. My hand was still on his chest. I was suddenly intensely aware of it, of the heat of him, of the steady, life-affirming beat of his heart beneath my palm. It was a brand, a claim. I should have removed it. Protocol, what little was left of it, demanded I re-establish distance, create a sterile zone, file a report in my head about the principal's emotional instability. My hand didn't move. He looked down at it, at my fingers splayed against his shirt. He watched it for a moment, as if it were a foreign object he was trying to understand. Then he slowly, tentatively, raised his own hand and covered mine. His fingers were cold, but they wrapped around my own with a surprising strength. A desperate grip. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was the action of a drowning man clinging to a lifeline. And I was that lifeline. The current that had been pulling us together since the moment we were locked in this room crested, and we were caught in its undertow. "Don't," he whispered, his voice hoarse. It was a single word, but it held a universe of meaning. Don't let go. Don't leave. Don't pretend this didn't happen. Don't go back to being a statue by the door. My throat was tight. Words were a foreign language I had forgotten how to speak. So I just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A promise. An affirmation. He let out a shuddering breath, a sound of profound relief, and closed his eyes. He kept his hand over mine, our fingers intertwined on his chest. We sat like that, tethered together in the dim light, two prisoners finding a strange, terrifying solace in their shared cell. The professional line had not just been crossed, it had been erased from existence. I was no longer Liam, the bodyguard. I was just Liam. And he was not the principal. He was Theodore. And he was holding my hand. The tension in the room had transformed. It was no longer a crackling, uncertain static between two poles. It was now a thick, magnetic pull, a palpable force that bent the space between us. Every breath was shared, every movement registered. The air itself felt different, charged with a terrifying and exhilarating potential. The lie of my professionalism was dead and buried. Now we were left with the raw, undeniable truth of whatever this was. He eventually pulled away, but the disengagement was slow, reluctant. The loss of his weight against me left me feeling suddenly cold, unmoored. He moved to the other side of the bed, putting a few feet of space between us, but the connection remained, an invisible thread that stretched taut across the sheets. He finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear in the stillness. "You're not just doing your job, are you?" The direct challenge. The final threshold. He had voiced the question that had been screaming in my mind for 48 hours. He was forcing the issue, tearing down the last shred of plausible deniability I was clinging to. I could lie. I could retreat into the jargon of my profession. "My duty is to provide comprehensive support, sir. That includes psychological reassurance during high-stress situations." The words were there, lined up in my head, a final, pathetic line of defense. They tasted like ash in my mouth. I looked at him across the expanse of the bed. He was watching me, his expression open, vulnerable, waiting. He had shown me his weakness, his fear. He had trusted me with it. To lie to him now would be the greatest betrayal of all. My heart was a heavy, painful weight in my chest. The choice was clear. I could try to rebuild the fortress, retreat into the lonely safety of my rules. Or I could walk out of the ruins and meet him in the open field of this terrifying new reality. It was a choice between self-preservation and a connection I was beginning to realize I craved more than I craved air. I made the conscious choice. I surrendered. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the force of a detonation. It was a confession, an admission. The truth. Relief washed over his features, so potent it was like watching a muscle unclench after holding a strain for days. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the lockdown began. He didn't smile, but the tension around his eyes and mouth eased. "I didn't think so," he whispered. The silence that followed was one of mutual understanding. The unspoken had finally been given a voice, however small. We had acknowledged the gravity between us. Now the only question was whether we would let ourselves fall. He shifted, moving closer, his movements slow, hesitant. He was testing the water, giving me every opportunity to retreat, to put up my hands and halt his advance. I didn't move. I stayed right where I was, a willing, waiting island. My entire body was a tightly coiled spring of anticipation. My blood sang in my veins. This was it. The point of no return. He stopped when his knee was almost touching mine. The heat from his body washed over me again, but this time, I didn't fight it. I leaned into it, a flower turning toward the sun. He looked at me, his gaze intense, searching. He was asking for permission. He was offering a choice. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a plea, a command born of desperate need. It was the only order I had ever wanted to receive. I moved then, closing the final inch between us. The motion was fluid, inevitable, like a river reaching the sea. My hand came up, not out of training or instinct, but out of pure, unadulterated want. I cupped the side of his face, my thumb stroking the sharp line of his jaw. His skin was cool, smooth. He leaned into my touch, his eyes fluttering shut, a soft sigh escaping his lips. It was a sound of complete and total surrender. And in that moment, I surrendered too. All the fear, all the rules, all the years of rigid self-control, it all dissolved into nothing. There was only this: the quiet of the room, the warmth of his skin under my hand, the soft sound of his breathing, and the undeniable, terrifying, beautiful truth that we were no longer alone. The walls of the suite were still standing, but our own private fortresses had finally, completely collapsed. The initial lie, the premise of my presence here, had been a simple one. I was his bodyguard, a function, a tool. My purpose was his physical safety. But as my hand rested on the side of his face, the warmth of his skin seeping into my palm, that lie felt like a story from another lifetime. It was a flimsy piece of fiction that had been utterly dismantled by the truth of the last 2 days. The truth was in the way he leaned into my touch, a silent, desperate confession of need. The lockdown, I started to say, the word feeling clumsy, foreign. I was trying to grasp at the remnants of our old reality, of the roles we were supposed to be playing. The reason I'm here—
Is that why you're here? He whispered, his eyes still closed.
His voice was a low vibration that I felt more than heard. He didn't move his hand from where it still rested over my heart, a constant, grounding pressure.
Is it just the job?
The question was a formality. We both knew the answer. The truth was no longer in the protocols or the mission briefings. It was in this space, in the inches between our bodies, in the shared air we were breathing. My entire life had been a series of lies I told myself to maintain control. You don't need anyone. Connection is a weakness. Your armor will protect you. No, I said again, the word coming out rough, torn from a place deep inside me I had kept locked away. The job is the lie. His eyes opened. They were clear, stripped of all fear and irony. They were filled with a raw, terrifying vulnerability that mirrored my own. He had needed to hear it, and I had needed, more than I ever knew, to say it. To finally speak a single, honest truth. He brought his other hand up, his fingers gently closing around my wrist, the one connected to the hand on his face. He wasn't pulling me away. He was holding me there, securing me. The world narrowed to this single point of contact. The pressure of his fingers on my pulse point, the thrum of my own blood, a frantic, wild rhythm. The scent of him, sandalwood and clean skin, and the faint metallic tang of fear now turned to relief. It was an overload of sensory information, but it wasn't chaotic. It was a symphony. For the first time, the data wasn't something to be analyzed and cataloged. It was something to be felt. He moved first. A slow, deliberate closing of the final distance. It wasn't a rush of passion. It was a yielding, a collapse. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against mine. The contact was electric. Skin to skin, bone to bone. I could feel the faint tremor in him, or maybe it was me. I couldn't tell where one of us ended and the other began. I closed my eyes. The darkness was a relief. There was nothing left to observe, nothing to analyze. There was only this, the solid, grounding pressure of his skull against mine, the warmth of his breath ghosting across my lips, the feeling of his heart beating a steady, reassuring rhythm under my hand. My other arm, the one that had been frozen at my side, came up, wrapping around his back. I pulled him closer, my hand splayed across his shoulder blades. The soft cashmere of his sweater was a friction of reality under my palm. He was real. This was real. He wasn't a principal. He was Theodore. And he was in my arms. He made a sound, a low, guttural groan that was part relief, part desperation. It vibrated through his chest and into mine. He sagged against me, his body molding to mine, and buried his face in the curve of my neck. His breath was hot against my skin. His arms came around my waist, his hands clutching the fabric of my shirt at my back, as if he were afraid I would dissolve and disappear. This was the embrace. The final, unconditional surrender. It was not gentle. It was a desperate, foundational act. It was the hug of two people who had been starving and had finally found sustenance. It was shelter. It was an anchor in the storm. I held him tighter, my chin resting on the top of his head, breathing in the scent of his hair. I felt the tension drain out of my own body. Years of coiled readiness, of rigid self-containment, finally letting go. The weight was immense. The relief was biblical. We stayed like that, locked together. Two fortresses collapsed into a single, shared ruin. There were no words. Words were insufficient. They were the tools of the old world, the world of lies and protocols. In this new world, the only language that mattered was the steady beat of two hearts, the grounding weight of two bodies, and the silent, profound promise that passed between us. You are not alone anymore. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the long, slow exhale of the world. We eventually shifted, the desperate vertical embrace softening into something else. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his face softened by the dim light, his eyes dark and wide. Without a word, he lay back on the bed, pulling me with him. My arm was still around him, his was still around my waist. We settled onto our sides, facing each other, our legs tangled together. His head found the hollow of my shoulder, his face tucked into my neck again, as if it were the only safe harbor in the world. I pulled the duvet over us. It was a simple, domestic act, so far removed from my training and my past life that it felt like a dream. But the weight of his body, the heat of him seeping into my bones, the rhythmic puff of his breath against my throat, it was all undeniably real. My hand came to rest in his hair, my fingers threading through the soft strands. It was an act of comfort, an act of possession, an act of pure, unadulterated tenderness that I never thought myself capable of. The silence that filled the room now was a new element entirely. It was not the pressurized silence of confinement, nor the exhausted silence of a crisis averted. It was a shared stillness, a comfortable, grounding quiet that needed no words to fill it. It was the silence of arrival. He fell asleep first. I knew the exact moment it happened. The last vestiges of tension left his body, his weight settling more heavily against me. His breathing deepened, falling into the slow, even rhythm of deep rest. For the first time since we were sealed in this room, he was truly, peacefully asleep. Safe. I remained awake, a sentinel of a different kind. My purpose had not changed, but its definition had been rewritten. I was still his protector, but now I was protecting his peace. I was guarding his dreams. I stared into the dimness of the room, listening to the sound of his breathing, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my ribs. The steel walls around us were no longer a prison. They were a sanctuary. They had locked the world out, yes, but in doing so, they had locked us in. They had forced a collision that had shattered us both, and from the pieces, something new and fragile was being built. A soft chime echoed through the suite, impossibly loud in the quiet. It was followed by the hiss of hydraulics. I felt Theodore stir against me, his body tensing in his sleep.
"It's okay," I murmured, my voice a low rumble against his ear. "I've got you."
He settled again instantly, sinking back into sleep, into the safety I had promised.
The steel shutters over the windows were retracting, sliding upwards with a smooth mechanical hum. A sliver of gray pre-dawn light sliced into the room, then widened, flooding our cocoon with the pale, clean light of a new day. The lockdown was over. The threat, whatever it had been, was neutralized. We were free to go. The light fell across Theodore's face, illuminating the peaceful, unguarded expression he wore in sleep. The sight of it caused a painful, protective ache in my chest. The world was about to rush back in. The world of his father, of his obligations, of our impossible, prescribed roles. The lie was waiting for us, just outside the door. But something had fundamentally changed. The lie no longer had any power. We could walk out that door, and I could resume my position 2 steps behind him. He could once again become the principal, and I his shadow. We could put the masks back on. But we would both know what was underneath. We would both know the truth of what had happened in this room. He began to wake, his breathing changing, his eyelashes fluttering against my neck. He shifted, pressing closer for a moment, before his mind caught up with his body. He became aware of the light, of the open windows, of my arms around him. He lifted his head, blinking against the morning. He looked at the windows, then back at me. There was no panic in his eyes, no regret, just a quiet, sober understanding. An unspoken pact formed between us in that shared gaze. This wasn't an ending. It wasn't an anomaly to be forgotten. It was a beginning. The details were uncertain, the future a fog, but the foundation was solid. We would figure it out. Together. He didn't move away. I didn't let go. The door to our gilded cage was open, but for now we remained inside, in the new reality we had built. I had spent my life building a fortress to keep the world out, believing that strength was in the height of my walls and the coldness of my armor. I believed that connection was a vulnerability to be defended against. But in the ruins of that fortress, holding this man in my arms, I finally understood the truth. True strength wasn't in the armor. It was in the breathtaking, terrifying act of letting someone else in. Vulnerability wasn't the weakness I had feared. It was the only sanctuary that had ever truly mattered. The professional line was gone, and in its place was a lifeline, and I would hold on to it for as long as he would let me.